Hello and welcome. I'm David Distors, local history librarian at Bexley Public Library. We're so excited to have Tom Betti and Doreen Uhas Sauer of Columbus Landmarks with us this evening. And now a few words of introduction about tonight's speakers. Tom Betti and Doreen Uhas Sauer are co-authors of several books about Columbus history, including their recent title, Forgotten Landmarks of Columbus, which will be on sale after their presentation for $20. Proceeds benefit the preservation efforts of Columbus Landmarks. Doreen is a longtime educator associated with Columbus City Schools and past Ohio Teacher of the Year. She has served as board president for the Columbus Landmarks Foundation and has received statewide recognition for her work in preservation education. Tom is dedicated to bringing history to life through entertaining storytelling. He served on the board of Columbus Landmarks Foundation for 2 full terms and chaired the Education Committee. He was lead researcher on the National Register of Historic Places nominations for both the Hartman Hotel building and the Athletic Club of Columbus.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. Happy birthday to Bexley, early birthday, I should say. A lot of familiar faces in the audience. Good to see some old friends. So our talk today is about Forgotten Landmarks of Columbus. We are going to show you some pictures. If you haven't picked up our book yet, we're going to show you some pictures that only a few people in Columbus have seen. They're very rare pictures. Some of them are the earliest pictures known to exist of Columbus. We'd like to start with this quote. Figure it out. Okay. We can't afford to lose more buildings that are important to our city. We have to look around and say, look, this building made an impact. What we need to do is take a lesson from the fact that we have lost important landmarks, especially because some just became parking lots, and that's a tragedy. And that's by our good friend, Bob Loversich, who is an architect here in Columbus. The book that we're talking about this evening is Forgotten Landmarks of Columbus. The original title of this book was Lost Columbus, and we really didn't like that. So we went back and forth with the publisher, and the publisher came back and said, okay, you need to do Forgotten Columbus Landmarks. And we said, well, we don't really like that because the organization that we wrote this book for, Columbus Landmarks Foundation, it sounds like we're forgetting that organization. So we kind of settled on Forgotten Landmarks of Columbus, Lost and Saved. So some of the buildings that we cover in this book are still standing, but at some point in history, they were forgotten and they were saved. And then other buildings that we talk about in this book were unfortunately lost. And that's kind of the bookends that we did for our book. And when we put together this book, at least my thinking, and I had some convincing to use the next photograph, was let's do a book about putting people in a time machine and taking them forwards and backwards in time, meaning that we take someone from present day and drop them in 1920, we take someone from 1920, drop them in 1860, and we take someone from 1860 and drop them in 1900 Columbus. And aside from the State House, neither of those people would be able to recognize State House Square because it has changed dramatically throughout those decades. So that's kind of the theme that I was thinking about in the book. And I can turn it over to Doreen and she can tell you about what she thought of the book.
Part of this is a generational difference between Tom and I. But we are actually both from Cleveland, and oddly enough, I have to always explain this. When I first met Tom, how long ago was it?
18 years ago, 17, something like that.
Yeah, he was 11 and a half. Was when he came to Landmarks to be a board member and was interested in the education part and the history part. And the difference in our ages, I really am the age of his parents. But it turns out that his last name was very familiar to me, and we finally pieced it together. And that was my father had always worked at the East Side Market in Cleveland. If you know Cleveland, most people know the West Side Market. My father was one of the people who worked at the East Side Market, East 55th and Woodland. And it turned out that Tom's grandfather was across the way with the Betti groceries. My father was the butcher, and Tom's grandfather was the grocery part of it. So we have these sort of roots in Cleveland together, which means there's no great qualification that except that we can swear both of us in different languages, because that's what Cleveland teaches you. So when we approached this book, one of the things I had the advantage of, I think, is knowing how Landmarks had started, literally the night that the Union Station was torn down. And being part of that and seeing it on the 11 o'clock news and people in Columbus, I'm just wondering if any of you also remember the Union Station either standing or falling down. A couple people. It was in 1977, and no one had suspected that the building was threatened at all. Battelle had actually owned the building. They were proceeding to, especially the talk was that they were going to renovate and use the facade. They were going to do all this, but a closer inspection of the budget was that they had actually put no money toward that the previous fall. And so at 11 o'clock at night, the night before a football game in a blinding rain, the bulldozers moved in on the facade of the Union Station, and it was crumbling before our eyes. People got in their car. My husband and I were no exceptions, and got in a car and drove down there like, what is going on? And people were just, their mouths were open. They were just astonished, because at no point did any of us think that would ever happen. And in addition to all of trying to figure this out, some of you may know Nancy, Ritchie, and Jeff Darby were part of this. You know, we were actually at a judge's house in the middle of the night asking for a restraining order, and that was granted by someone Tom will meet later, George Smith, who's now passed away. And he could not sign the restraining order because he was a judge. He had to find someone else. So other people went out and convinced the bulldozer driver not to finish tearing down. And that is how the one arch remains in the park today, which is part of the Arena District. And that was one of the secondary arches, not even kind of the main one, while the whole thing was sorted out. This is the same year when Battelle, and I do want to stress this, is a very different organization now. Battelle lost all of their federal funding for that project that was to go into the new convention center, the Hyatt that was there. And they were also in trouble with the courts because they had purchased most of the property, which had come up to be Victorian Village later. In fact, the maps had started to show that it was to be a Battelle research park, and there was to be no buildings left that would have been part of the University District where I live. So that would have taken it down to Fifth Avenue, and past Fifth, those would be gone too. And they were ordered by the court to put new roofs on them, plumbing, other things in terms of, gutters and to protect the roof and whatnot. And they had to form a separate company, and that was the Renaissance Realty Company, where then they sold them. So the way it was really described in a way as Landmarks came on, not by any group except common citizens, some in history, some in preservation, some just horrified, and came together and started Landmarks from that. That was the beginning of a preservation really in Columbus. Victorian Village, German Village, all of them are going to start to come on with that. The stories, I think that's an important story of how we lost something. I think the Ohio Theater was an important story of how we saved something. I think each one of these cases, and Tom did a yeoman's job of really researching 21 buildings to figure out what were the lessons to be learned and how did this happen. And then in between that set of lessons, because some are lost and some are saved and some are forgotten, was really the rest of the narrative of the history of Columbus. How is it that this happened here? What was the attitude of historic preservation in the 1800s, 1880, 1890 in Columbus? What suddenly happened in 1920? And just as kind of a teaser, how did that interplay, especially with the families, some of the older families who were in the downtown, start to move east, primarily along the Broad Street corridor into Bexley and other places. So that is the second part of the story. And the last chapter was devoted to cultural amnesia, the things that we we don't think are significant until we realize a story that's there. And I think the best example, and is in the book, is Poindexter Village. 40 buildings dedicated by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, first public housing in the United States. Essentially, it's segregated housing, but it's essentially set up for people who are more than likely living in hovels. This is the kind of the tail end of not just the Depression, but the Great Migration, where Ohio absorbed a lot of the movement out of the South. And in fact, Columbus itself absorbed more African-American migration than Cleveland or Akron. A lot went, of course, to Detroit for jobs and whatnot. So the book became sort of this idea of how do we somewhat learn from the past or be aware, and also to remind us that it's not all grim. There are things that get saved. So
we're going to hop in our time machine, and I'm going to show you a picture, one of the earliest pictures known to be in Columbus, probably in the 1860s. And this is, if you're standing on Broad Street looking south, High Street is over here. And then directly parallel to us, in front of us, is State Street, and the State House is that way. So again, nobody from 1920 or to the present would recognize what Capitol Square looked like.
but we will give you a few surprises, and that is, as we did the research, we found out that some of the buildings that were actually considered to be the very oldest on Capitol Square were not. There were other buildings, and that early on, there were some streets like State Street, which you're seeing kind of head on the left-hand side of the screen, have always been sort of a theater district of some sort. And there's a reason why they're there, like the Ohio Theater, and they weren't alone. So we were always peeling back more layers of the onion and finding more things. And these were some of the photos we felt were important to be able to have at least a visual record of what we were talking about.
So again, the State House is right over there. You can kind of see it. And straight ahead is State Street. The next picture, we're going to actually turn around, and this is the famous corner of Broad and High. And we are looking at Broad Street, and High Street is coming this way.
On the very corner, Broad and High, where some of you may remember, actually it was saved by a Bexleyite, Ray Pawkin's son, was the Roy's Jewelers, all right, the incandescent things. And according to Mr. Pawkin, who we just had dinner with a couple months ago, that sign is still in a warehouse. His son has been in Chicago for a long period of time, but he's never let that sign go. And it is still out there. This incandescent sign was wonderful. But what was funny is before there was a Roy's Jewelers, or the building that was there originally, which was an oyster house, that was Trinity Episcopal Church. And Trinity Episcopal Church, I think this is so quaint of a story. They moved because the corner was too noisy. So they moved to the corner of State House Square, where they are now, which is really a block and a half away on 3rd Street. So you move because your church is in a place where there's too much traffic and you can't hear the service, and you move a block and a half away and stay for the next 140 years,
The next picture is the picture that's on the cover of our book. This is Columbus's, technically it's the second city hall, because the first city hall was above the Central Market. But this was the first building dedicated to City Hall. And it was on State Street, where the Ohio Theater is today. That's where it used to stand. And when it was built in the 1880s, it was the jewel of Columbus. Everyone loved it. It has this weird French Bastille Gothic kind of architecture. Originally, it was supposed to have a steeple. And it looks kind of like a church, but it was never designed to be a church. It was always designed to be City Hall. The Columbus Library was on the bottom floor. City Council Chambers was on the 2nd floor. And surprisingly enough, on the 3rd floor was a basketball court. So, which is very odd because it's, wood floors. So if you can imagine city council trying to get through a city council meeting and there's a basketball game in the boom, boom, boom. It must have been interesting. So Columbus City Council really, they were kind of done with this building. They wanted to move. And in the 1910s, probably about 1918, 1919, they were trying to find a new location for a new city hall complex. And they were looking at the river and
The 1913 flood had already happened, so urban renewal was possible.
so they just didn't like this building anymore. They kind of outgrew this building. And when a fire happened in 1921, the city council was ecstatic because now that the building's been damaged by fire, this is the perfect excuse not to repair it, and we can build a new city hall. And that city hall is the one that is by the river on City Center Drive or Civic Center Drive today on Broad Street.
This was also the building that when the fire erupted, this is when James Thurber was a Cub reporter. And he got so excited because he was covering this unbelievable fire story. And he writes about it later that he forgot to file the story for the paper. And he was part of the rescue efforts. I mean, it's true Thurber, and it's Thurber-esque. I think he lived his life the way he wrote it. One of the things that's kind of interesting, because remember, I've already mentioned that State Street seemed to have a lot of theaters, and they changed names, and they're here and they're there. And part of that reason was the hotels were located mostly on High Street, but the hotel owners, knowing that a venue was important to bring people downtown. And the biggest thing was for the legislatures were in session most of the year. And so suddenly the downtown was booming, and it was a man's world. At the bottom of this particular building was the proverbial newsstand, cigar stand. This is so typical. Some of you who know the elevator bar downtown, the Bott Brothers, the old thing, that was the same thing. It's, it's the man's bastion. But you would notice to the left is that there is a sign painted there. And so it was a little bit easier to figure out a date on this one in its last years, because burlesque suddenly became was permitted in Columbus. Most of the time it was outlawed. And so it's part of this specialty I think I've acquired in my life, is studying the vice habits of Columbusites from the Civil War right through the 1920s. And the stories are absolutely amazing. There were, for instance, more houses of prostitution in the 1880s and 90s than you would have almost thought it was possible by population, which was not as great as the number of people there were engaged in essentially brothels and other things. Having yesterday in the heat of the Sunday, just finished a tour at Greenlawn called Brewers and Brothels, and schlocking around in the humidity to tell stories of these people is really kind of like what we were doing with the book. There is a similarity of time in what happens in Columbus in the early days as we see today. In the early days, Columbus is a crossroads. You can go east-west, that's Route 40. You can go north-south, that's 23. It all seems to come together in downtown. We're a crossroads. In 1848, 11,000 new people came into Columbus from Germany and other places, and immigrants, and 11,000 left and said, we're out of here, it's too crowded. And they went on to places like Nebraska, which they then named places like New Ohio and New Destler. And it's just like, it's crazy. We lose some, we gain some, we lose some. But the downtown remains a man's, it was his domain. There are very few places, with the exception of Lazarus and another sort of shopping emporium by the Baldwin Gwen family, which we'll probably won't touch on this, I'll mention. Those are the ancestors of Anderson Cooper, who is on the MSNBC, because he's married into the Vanderbilt family. Those are the only two shopping emporiums where women were really allowed. So the burlesque thing becomes part of the story of men, as the prostitutes do, because we are still the same problem. We are a highly trafficked city. Human trafficking flows through Columbus, east-west and north-south. and it's almost the same as it was, you know, more than 100 years ago. So we can learn from sometimes what happens to these buildings or how they're used. It's the same social conditions that we see today.
So this picture was not our first choice to be on the cover of our book. The next picture was at least my first choice, but it wasn't high res enough to be on the cover. So we settled with this picture because many people don't know what it is. They think it's a church if they don't see that it says City Hall on the front. And it's an interesting picture because, you know, it looks very unique from a Columbus architecture perspective. But the picture that I like is this picture. This picture is the corner of High and Broad. There are two structures in this picture that are still standing. Again, if you take someone from 2022 and drop them into, this is probably about 1920, maybe 1919. They wouldn't be able to recognize it. So we see the Wyandotte Building, which is right there. And that building is still standing. And then we also see this building right here. That's called the Harrison Building. And that is still standing too. However, you would not recognize it because that is half of the Huntington Bank Building that is there. So in the late 1920s, instead of tearing down this building and constructing a new building, Huntington Bank decided to start construction, which you can see in this picture. So it's probably later than I had said. This is probably about 1925 now that I think about it, because the new building, the new Huntington Bank Building, is being constructed next door. And what will happen is when they finish it, they will put a new facade on the front of it. And most people will never know that it's two buildings combined. So that's a really good example of an early adaptive reuse.
And one of the ways too that's really was surprising was between the corner with that odd little shaped building, which was actually worked as sort of a weather tower for the city, but was in early Huntington Bank. And the Wyandotte Building is another tall building with, you don't see it so well here, with a rounded arch on the facade. And that didn't come down until the early 1970s. And yet you can ask people, do you remember everything? They go, no, never remembered seeing this. And but I remember going to a show somewhere around there. Most of these buildings actually have theaters in them, and that's what they're remembering. The theater was embedded within the building, and that's also what happens on State Street. Office buildings that are built as office buildings often have a kind of another added feature, this assembly area. So this again becomes kind of an oddball. And we found a quote from a man in a newspaper when the Harrison Building was being built, and people were astonished because it was a dizzying height, you know, and they would watch people building up there and throwing hot rivets at each other and steel construction. And one old timer said, you know, it's a blight on the city. It's a blight. Tall buildings are a blight on the city. But I guess by next year sometime we'll forget what that looked like behind it. And, you know, ringing endorsement for high development.
This is probably 1926, now that I think about it. Broad and High, yes.
And,
That's the Dr. Smith sculpture.
mhm. Yeah, the Dr. Smith sculpture is the most traveled piece of public art that Columbus ever had. After the doctor who helped everybody live downtown, helped everybody through typhoids and choleras and whatnot. And he is also the first person in the United States who was ever both a medical doctor and a psychiatric doctor. This was unheard of, and he practiced through OSU and other places like St. Francis. That on a trip to Germany with his family, he was taken by, he took a lot of looks at the center of little German towns where there was a well, and the well was where everybody gathered. You know, it's just kind of from the Middle Ages. And he said at one point, when I die, I really don't want to have a grave in a graveyard or in a cemetery. I'd like to be remembered by a well. And when he died, the family decided to fulfill his wish. His daughter, by the way, was a very trained opera singer and in Germany, so they were frequently in Germany. And so there was almost like the buddies and friends and family put together this statue of Dr. Smith. And it was actually a well. Now, what's crazy about this is the well had water and it ran in the water. And for all practical purposes, this thing is sticking out on Broad Street as if it were a rain garden or something. And after a while, the well stopped working, which was probably good because actually it was carrying typhoid and other things. Our water table is very high. The water systems in the city were uniquely always underfunded by sewers and other things. So they were carrying disease. And eventually it was, the statue still remained, and it was moved over to St. Francis Hospital by Grant, which is now gone. And then at that point, it was moved over to the health department on the other side of the river. When you might remember off Broad Street, there was a health department was there, and they put him there. And I love the newspaper article that said, one day, 2 employees of the health department out smoking a cigarette by the statue and said, hey, it's gone. Where to go? And it was like, it was stolen. It was stolen. And the person or the group that stole it, they actually eventually found it because it still exists. They were selling it as if it were President Garfield. You know, they thought it was a statue of President Garfield. And when he was retrieved, at that point, he was still sort of movable, but they put him next to the old medical building on Neal Avenue at OSU, which is where he would have practiced. So he's safe on OSU's campus, but nobody would have ever expected a piece of public art to have such a varied life. I'm sorry, which one? Uh-huh. Right.
Also in this picture is the second Neal House Hotel. And I'm going to go to a panoramic photo that was taken on top of the State House.
And you can really see the Harrison building here, how tall it is.
So the Neal House is right in front of us, and the Destler Hotel is over here. And this picture was probably taken 1918 or so. The Destler was built in 1916, and the Levesque Tower has not been built yet. So that's kind of where, I mean, when we say circa, it could be, you know, give or take a couple years.
Right. And we did a book on hotels that is still around that really gets into the Destler and to the Neal. So we didn't necessarily dwell on them, but in trying to explain how Columbus evolved even into the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, which was really threatening times for preservation. That was the site of the Vern Rife Center and the Huntington Center, the big one, all of that. And what we found was that there were secrets in that whole line of buildings that were behind the buildings or embedded in buildings that never were fully realized. Buildings from the 1840s that were still in part there in part of that series.
And this is another view to the north side of the State House, looking, see where it says Outlook Building? That is where Chamber of Commerce Outlook Building, that is where the Rhodes Tower is today. The Hayden Clinton building, bank building is still there. We always thought that that was the oldest building on Capitol Square. However, in conducting research for this book, we're amending that, and it is one of the oldest buildings on Capitol Square. But the Heartland Bank building, as it's called today, on the corner of State and High, that is actually older. That was built in 1862.
Right.
And this building, the Hayden Clinton Bank building, I believe it was 1866 that it was built.
While we're on this slide for just a moment, if you notice where the first Congregational Church is, of course, that building is now gone. That would have been Washington Gladden's church. And First Congregational moved further to by the Art Museum and was done there by Alexander Pope, who actually did the Jefferson Memorial. That's the architect of that church. But I want you to notice the house that's immediately next to it, not the light colored one on the left-hand side, but the darker one right at the corner. And keep that one kind of in mind. That is a Destler house, and it plays into what happened to the downtown in another story that we'll pick back up, but at least we can see it here.
And here is another picture, and this one is of the Huntington Bank building completed with the new facade. Again, you have two buildings that were combined, and then they put a brand new front on it, and it's indistinguishable. And then also next to it, on that side right there, is the second Neal House Hotel. So this was probably taken in the early 30s or late 20s.
One of the things that's very interesting, and when Tom says traveling in a time machine and people wouldn't recognize it, that is especially true of the 1920s. In 1920, that decade, Columbus was the 27th largest city in the United States. Not terribly big, not if you're from Cleveland originally or Cincinnati. It's kind of a mid-sized city, and it's always been a governmental city. That's where the bread and butter come from. It's not necessarily the artisan city of Cincinnati or the immigrant city of Cleveland. Its actual flowering is what we're living in now. This is much more the largest thing that we're sort of dealing with is the growth of Columbus. But it turns out that as the 27th largest city, it actually was 14th in the entire nation in the number of building permits that were issued. Literally, downtown changed. A lot of course, there are other things like Grandview is coming in, parts of Bexley are coming in. There is some growth in the Clintonville area. Yes, that accounts for some of it. But the downtown buildings were changed so much that there was a convention in the 20s in which they had invited Herbert Hoover to speak about development. And every single building that we've mentioned so far and others that are still around, like the Toledo Savings Building, which is where Mitchell's restaurant is, where it's kind of an Art Deco top to it that was sometimes called looking like electric tail lights on the top of the building. They were all in the process of either having just been completed or going to be completed. So the building boom downtown was immense. And some of the buildings lost early, I think we have one in particular by the old Dispatch building, were astonishing. And they were gone in the 20s to accommodate cars as a parking lot. Parking lots start early. Yeah.
So right in the center here is the Destler Hotel, which was demolished in 1969. You can also see that the Levesque Tower is built in this picture. This picture is probably 1940s, maybe late 1940s, mid 1940s. And Doreen's favorite topic is the Roy's jeweler. On this side is Roy's watches. And then on the other side, it's Roy's diamonds.
And that's what's still left, is in a warehouse somewhere.
So one of the questions that we, pose in this book, and it's kind of a theme throughout the book, is what is a landmark? So the question for the audience, and you can just blurt it out, name a Columbus landmark. So the State House is a landmark, right? The Great Southern Hotel, now called the Westin, that's a landmark. I'm sorry?
Where's the West?
The Westin is on High and Main Street, the Great Southern Fireproof Hotel. Okay. Anybody else? Lincoln Theater is a landmark.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Ohio Theater. Anybody else? Athenaeum. So the reason why we're asking this question is, what is an official definition of a landmark? I'm not going to read this, but Merriam-Webster says that this is a landmark. Our definition is a little bit different. Our definition in this book is landmarks are buildings, public art, urban artifacts, public spaces, or design landscapes that can serve to tell a fuller story of a city to its future citizens. For instance, the word landmark is very personal. For instance, the ice cream parlor that was at the end of a street you may have grown up on is a landmark to you. So that's kind of what our definition of landmark is throughout this book, is that it's very personal, and landmarks, as long as it has meaning, anything can be a landmark.
And before we actually started research, I was working with fourth graders in Columbus School on a project, and I was doing talks for Rotaries and senior citizens and we had tours. And every time we were doing something outreach anyway, we would stop and say, what do you think? What would you call a landmark? And we were starting to make mental notes of all of these. So with the idea of, exactly if we could kind of cover an example or two of everyone's, but really leave it back to how we define it, because a landmark in the 19th century, and I think we make the case in the book very well, was a terrible word to use. If you saw it in the newspaper today, you think, oh my God, where is it? And what are we going to be losing? If you saw it in a 19th century newspaper, it was a sign, thank God it's going, because we want to be modern. We want to be new. A landmark is a hovel. A landmark is an old building. It's easily expendable. So the nature of the word has completely changed. And I think that's kind of also an important lesson, that we can't necessarily blame the past generations who felt they were moving ahead. In some cases, like the Clock Restaurant, which is one of my favorites. I don't know if anybody else remembers it as the Clock, which is now the Bott Brothers. Oh, thank you. Somebody from my generation here.
It's now the elevator.
The elevator. And what was interesting is that clock, that cartoon clock, was actually a very, there are other pictures of it as a very staid, elegant clock. But when the restaurant, and remember when that building was purchased, the owner did not know that any of that stained glass was there. It had been so covered over. I remember going there in college with my father, who would come down to visit me from Cleveland, and it was one of the few places open along with Koenig's downtown where we might be able to get dinner before he drove to Cleveland. But you never knew any of that was there. So it was the same thing with the clock. They had designed the clock to be the cartoon, and then the bottom of the clock was actually a little seat you could sit in to wait for the bus or something. And the bicentennial, the Downtown Residents Association made a gift to the city. They started to go back to see how many clocks downtown, which is something Thurber always wrote about, the clocks of downtown still strike in my dreams. And they tried to save a number of them and restore some of them, and they were able to be successful. This is one that unfortunately met its demise because of a windstorm and came down with a sheer wind shear right into a parking meter and was absolutely smashed beyond repair. But these clocks were a part of exactly what Columbus was all about in somebody's mind, like Thurber. It was about efficiency. It was about catching the train on time. It was about going down to the railroad station. And all of that became sometimes it's called street furniture, the urban fabric of what somebody else would define as a landmark.
And I'm embarrassed to say this, but I should have included Rubino's in this slideshow,
Yeah.
because Rubino's is a landmark of
right.
Bexley, right? But we do have some other examples of landmark signs. One is the Planter Peanut sign downtown. It's moved around for
At least
I don't
four
know,
times.
4 different places. And then the Liska sign on Fifth Avenue, East Fifth Avenue, which, Doreen always likes to invite everybody. It's what, $5 for a burger and beer or
I would
something?
tell you, Anthony Liska is a professor at Denison, and it's his cousin who owns Liska's. And this is part of the old East Columbus, what's kind of left of it. And the place is not necessarily modernized, but I have a certain feeling for it, I guess, because somewhere by the bar, which has a few bad sayings, there is an image of the icon that you find in Poland, because Liska is Polish, of the icon of Częstochowa. And so you have this sort of odd thing going on here. My husband doesn't even like to go into the men's room. There's a whole other story there. But you can get 2 hamburgers and you can get 2 beers and 2 desserts for probably under $10. It's the biggest bargain around, but the Liskas are wonderful people. But I have to tell you, we did a tour of that area, and we did Liska's, we did the church across the street, we did the thing that was called, at one point, it was kind of the big arts and crafts house where they would do concerts in them. The day we were to do this, we were going to end in Liska's, and Mike Liska was going to, he does homemade pies, and they're wonderful. And it started to rain that day, and I stopped in to see how he was doing, and he said, oh, it's raining. And I said, well, ours is just a walking tour. I think we'll make it from here to there. We're not going to be in the rain too often. He said, no, that's not it. My meringue will fall. And it was kind of like, that's Liskus. The man was obsessed with his meringue.
Ah,
See?
there we go.
And that's where Aquinas still meets. It's a one of a kind place. It really is. So this is a better view of Dr. Smith and his unfortunate well that was spreading typhoid by the time it disappeared. But we better keep moving pretty quickly through these.
So, during World War I, this was a temporary structure placed on the State House grounds that, for people seeing it every day for 2-3 years, it was certainly a landmark to them. And this was to encourage people to buy war bonds during World War I, Liberty bonds.
And though it looks so sturdy, it was really made out of plywood and plaster. And that's what threw everybody when they see it in a photo.
Like this, this is considered a landmark as well. The first Wendy's restaurant across from Kosai.
And if you look at it carefully and you know that that's the Catholic Foundation today is in that building, that's who took it. It is like, I love the building of the Catholic Foundation, but it's the exact same footprint. It's like you can drive through Columbus and find every fast food place and you can tell the evolution, like they were Arabian horses or something of the building. And the interior, Reed Wasserstrom had told me that they spent the night before that opened. Of course, that was their first store, stringing all those beads that were there. Wasserstrom has always been heavily invested in that.
I'm sorry? It's not there anymore now.
Well, the building has actually been reconstructed to look like a small medieval church. You're right, Wendy's is not there. It became converted in a way to a small medieval church. And when you look at the outside, you can definitely see that it was the same building.
For instance, the Santa Maria. Some people think that, this is a landmark. It's certainly a landmark to a generation of elementary school kids that went to it, and it was an event to go to. Doreen and I look at it and it's a fiberglass, thing.
It's not actually, it's wood. It was absolutely constructed to be specific to the Santa Maria, which never made it back to Europe.
But again, this could be a landmark in, someone's mind.
And it is in dry dock permanently south of Columbus in a field owned by the city, where Parks and Rec actually owns it, and there are trees to grow there, and it's in about 4 pieces. It will never be reconstructed.
So go ahead. Oh, it's not in a park, it's in a private
It's
area.
It's in there. I don't want to call it a junkyard. It is in kind of a tree yard.
Storage.
But it's out in the elements. It's not in a building or anything, and you can actually find it. In fact, if you go online, you can Google and you'll see pictures of it where it is today in pieces, but not in a park.
Which is a good segue before we get to the next slide. When they temporarily move a structure or something, 9 times out of 10, it's never going to be reconstructed. We saw that with the Kelley Mansion in the 1960s. We saw it with the Santa Maria, even though I don't know why we would want to reconstruct it, but that's not for me to say. So it's very rare that when, actually we saw that a little bit with the Ohio Penn as well. That when a developer says, oh, we're going to label everything and reconstruct it later in a different location, view that with some skepticism based on history. So we're going to go into, Doreen is obsessed with this topic. So we're going to go into, some may think that these are landmarks, and that's fine. The Great Southern or the Great Western Shopping Center.
All right. Now, how many of you remember this and loved it? Come on, a couple of you. Any of you? It was out in the Westland area past the hilltop, and the shopping center is still there. It was in the parking lot. And don't spoil my presentation.
Okay.
It was a brainchild of the Castro organization. And of course, we still know that name today. This was the originator, the first generation of Castros. And he gave it as a gift to the children of Columbus. It was to be his rendition of some of the ancient wonders of the world, some of the modern ones, some of the natural wonders. He sort of made his own list of about 8 of them, and it was called the Walk of Wonders. And one of my favorites, of course, and I did get to see this in college at a moment where it took my breath away. I could not believe anybody would create this, that he had created Niagara Falls. Now, and you can see from the size of the woman who's standing there that the falls were obviously in miniature, but there was this little town there. And whenever it would rain, the parking lot never really drained well. So the falls suddenly had lots of falls. And occasionally, if there was a kid on a tour or a college kid, they were great from Ohio State coming here, they would throw a few soap suds in it. But whenever it rained, all of a sudden that town disappeared. And it was like little people going, you know, they were like being washed downstream. There is, we'll see what comes up next.
Oh, we go to Egypt next.
So you can go to
in
Egypt.
Columbus.
And all of this is gone. The maintenance on it was impossible to keep. It made every national magazine because these are shopping centers coming post World War II, and they're looking for how to attract people. And so you can see the shopping center; those buildings are still in the back.
And then we go to France.
And this is the only one that's still remaining. Some of you may have seen it in the last couple of months. It was in the Dispatch and Linda Deutsch's column because it was lasting, and it's actually in the backyard of one of the Skilkins, because Casto and Skilkin were in partnership with this. And I think a grandson of the Skilkins, I think it's in Westerville.
And then you could see Greece in the background.
And the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And what else do we have?
And then we go to India.
Right to the Taj Mahal. And this
The
is
Grand Canyon.
the Grand Canyon. Now, doesn't this strike you as particularly like a pothole in Columbus in the middle of winter? It's about the same size, same scale. The Sphinx, the poor Sphinx got especially sometimes desecrated because there were a number of fraternities that used the Sphinx as their symbol, and they would come out here and play pranks on these things. So they took their wear and tear, but literally it was just the sheer upkeep of it. So this was a landmark suggested by some senior Rotarians who lived on the west side, because for them, this is still talked about. This was so extraordinary. And you can get a feeling for why it was important.
So we're gonna skip ahead to the Kelley Mansion.
Okay.
Did you have a question?
Did it fill up?
Oh, I don't know if Kroger's still there, but the Great Western Shopping Center is the Wonders of the World is long gone.
Right.
And you know, when we were writing this book, I had a little drinking game that every time she would talk about the Great Western Shopping Center, I would just have a drink of wine.
I won't tell you what I did. I think, why don't we move on? This is the hard one to see. Okay. So the Kelley Mansion, again, becomes the first actual real preservation battle in Columbus. And Dixie Sayre Miller, who is very much was embedded in Bexley history and one of the really wonderful people, was one of the first people I think I ever met when I was pretty much just volunteering at Landmarks, doing a little bit here and there. She was such a gracious and wonderful person. And she tried very hard to save this building. The Kelley Mansion was built roughly as a contemporary to the State House downtown. It's one of the earliest, certainly Greek revival buildings. It was spectacular. Alfred Kelley had designed it himself, all of the columns, all of the pieces that were used. He was a legislator from Cleveland who came to Columbus to guide what was going to be the canal system. He had these all floated downstream to come to Columbus. He designed it. It would have been around St. Joseph's Cathedral. And today, don't quite go there yet, though. If you see the size of these columns, this building still exists. It was taken apart with the idea that they were going to save the pieces and they were going to reconstruct it at some point. And without any other kind of funding, it wound up in Wolf Park. And then the 50s, the floods in the 1950s were, it was some of those huge pieces, and some are in big, still exist. They were thrown into Allen Creek as flood walls. They were kicked around here and there. The city was upset that they were just growing weeds there. And the Ohio Historical Society building was not built yet on Velma Avenue, nor was the village. The village was just talked about. And so at some point, these things move again. And now they're put in the parking lot of where the Ohio History Center is being built. And the architects who were essentially in charge of that building which is a brutalist architecture, had no interest in incorporating it in any kind of village that you could find. And the village has aged well, but let's put it this way, it's not Deerfield. It's not original smaller buildings put together, and architects sometimes call those petting zoos, where you move a building and you put them all together. This is Detroit. And then you get to walk through them and, oh yeah, sure, did Edison live here? And somebody who lived next door to him. They're all out of context. You don't do that in preservation unless you're absolutely forced to. So they wind up in the parking lot. At that point, they are threatened by the city to be cleared out. And there's just so much going on. And so what happens is they're put on a train and they're up in the Hale farm outside of Cleveland. And they are perfectly safe because some of these things never fell over. I mean, they are solid and they're there, but they are covered like this with poison ivy. They're very safe. And there has been talk for years. Maury Portman wanted to see some of this come back on Broad Street during the Ameriflora, another one of Reinhardt's schemes. The idea was to construct part of it as a facade. All the numbers had washed off. It would be millions to try to reconstruct. And then there are vast numbers of it that are finally missing. And so Dixie Sarah Miller led the charge. For a lot of people in Bexley helped to try to raise this. And the lessons were almost there as to how you don't run a campaign because you think that there are always going to be big donors. It has to be more bottoms up this. And so just before she died, she called Ohio History Center to Barb Powers, some of you know, and said, whatever you need to do, whatever, we're not going to try to save it, you know. So it still lies up there. Some of the pieces were used in a fireplace that's up there near the visitor center. And there has been some talk. I'm on the board of Greenlawn, and Randy Rogers Kelly is buried in Greenlawn, maybe getting one of the columns that or enough. And we would need the National Guard to help us get it down here to form something that would be by Kelly's grave that at least explains why he was so important. This house was the house that saved Ohio, teaching American history even to 7th graders when I first started 40 years. This house was known as that. And the governor at the time was Clevelander, who said, I don't want to see my money. I don't know anything about this guy. And so the state wouldn't give money. It was completely lost. And yet it had saved Ohio from the foreclosure on the New York bank system and the London banking system, because he had put his personal fortune up against it.
How are we doing on time?
I'm looking.
How do you get fortune?
I'm sorry?
How do you make it fortune?
Oh, how did Kelly make his fortune?
Oh, he was as cheap as they could possibly get, for one. And he was a legislator, he was a lawyer. When he came to Cleveland, he had married into a very, and I'll tell you a Greenlawn secret that we just learned, which has been kind of a revolutionary thing. He was married in upstate New York, and his wife's family was very wealthy. We're talking the late 1700s. They travel from upstate New York to Cleveland, where he buys real estate like everybody else in Columbus. It's real estate that makes you rich if the price is right when you sell it. That was William Neal with the Neal farm in Ohio State. But his fortune was built on his law practice. He was scrupulous as can be. And then he became in the legislature. So they moved to Columbus, where he built the house. And he was the architect. He was the sole proprietor of all of this. When they tore the house down, they found that he had the first indoor cistern system ever conceived in the United States. He purified water in what would be the basement, because the land he bought on Broad Street was a swamp. From the corner of that Broad and State Street, Broad and Grant Street, to the library, where the main library of the state was all a swamp. And so he was filtering the water. He did all these things. So his money was there and he invested wisely. I will tell you what one of the little secrets are that suddenly, in dealing with African-American burials at Greenlawn, was just a little disturbing until we could sort it out. As a wedding present, his father-in-law gave him a 5-year-old black girl, and they married, and Kelly and his wife come into Cleveland with a 5-year-old child. They don't have any children of their own. They are just married. And you wonder, what is going on here? And when she's seen on the records that had to be resolved, the black codes and whatnot, she's listed as indentured. Well, it's hard to be a 5-year-old indentured servant, so what were you? But in New York, slavery was still permissible. It wasn't in Ohio. So by bringing her in as indentured, what they were really agreeing to and saying is that she will board with us, we'll feed her, she's part of the family. It was a clever way of getting around the fact that she would not have had been considered a slave and had something happen to her, or at 13 be turned out to live whatever life she possibly could. They had actually protected her. So sometimes history reveals these interesting things that I just wanted to share with you. But his money was, he was paid fairly, but he spent so much of his time in Ohio trying to work on the canals that he developed malaria and actually died a little bit earlier than that. And then his descendants had the land where Memorial Hall still stands today and the Christopher Inn, which is a good segue.
Are we on until 8:30 or 8? Okay. Yeah.
It's pretty open, so just so everyone knows the library is open for the 8th, and but that's not going to be an issue. There's bathroom doors or.
So what we could do is we could open it up to questions.
Absolutely.
We could go on for another 2 hours if you want.
And the audience said, no, please not.
So I'll put this picture up, and do we have any questions from Zoom?
No questions yet.
Yes.
We have any idea where they put Christopher Columbus at?
Oh, yes, I do.
Funny you would mention that.
It's being voted on tonight. I was on the committee as the historian for it. And it's not been determined. There is a company that's been chosen to work on the exhibits. It is a classic example of difficult history, meaning in my mind, which is an actual form of history. It is not about preservation or this or that. It is about dealing with difficult issues that make people generally uncomfortable. But it is so involved with 7 or 8 great stories about how that statue came here and why it came here, and the end of World War II and the Eisenhower administration and the fear of enemy aliens after the war, and the Columbus being chosen really at the national level. Remember, we are a very Republican state with Taft and Bricker and all of these guys at that time. So what happens is that it is not determined that it will ever be reconstructed anywhere, right? But it will never be on the City Hall property, according to Andy Ginther, who made that determination. It could be somewhere else downtown on public. It could not necessarily be anywhere, but there's more of an exhibit explaining it. So that's as much as I can tell you right now, because it's still, the company is still wrestling with these issues. I'm sorry, please. You mean, how does it get here? Well, the company is going to do a lot of community outreach to people to get ideas and what they want to see done with it. And if it should go back somewhere, it should be replaced by a piece of public art. And then they're going to move in on it. And that's part of what the design challenges they will have. And there are places, for instance, in Richmond, the entire line of Confederate statues that ran down in Richmond, in their middle of their town, were all removed. And now what's happening is that's why people came, not because they were racist or extremist, but they came to see these statues as part of the history of the South. And with all of them gone, the property values have actually plummeted on that entire street. So it's kind of like, for every action, there's another reaction. So you try to do the best you can to keep people educated, engaged, and be truthful about history and how things come and how things go. So we're living in difficult times. That's why it's called difficult history.
Any other questions for us? Yes, sir.
So Broad Street still has, many of the big old homes, but there were many more.
Mhm.
How did they all disappear? And was it Sensenbrenner's administration that really kind of pushed that?
Sense in Brenner's administration, in what sense? I'm sorry.
Were they pushing the modernization of Broad Street and tearing down?
No, because that would have been starting in the 20s. And it was part of what was really considered the popular culture. We're entering a modern time. World War I is over. And if you think about it, there's a great cartoon in the Dispatch at the time of a little boy scratching his head saying, and I can't even quite repeat it all, but my sister is a suffragette and my grandfather votes for somebody else. And Columbus was actually socialist. You know, you hear about Wyland Park. That was Wyland as in the city council, who was a socialist. The socialist ticket was big. It was progressive government. So it's a trend to modernization, not pushed by anybody in particular. But I'm glad you brought this up, because if you remember, the house I said was right there at the corner by the church. That was the William Destler house. Destler, of course, with the hotel. That was his grandfather who starts that, or his father rather. His grandfather, of course, is David Destler, who starts a banking institution, old storied name. William builds that house, and his garden is beautiful and it's great. And all of that modernization of the 20s is now starting to change property values. I think we can relate to that. And suddenly now other people want to come in. There is the Vendome Hotel, which becomes a parking lot in 1920s, which was a mansion that was gorgeous. Back next to where the Dispatch building is, it's still a parking lot for the Dispatch. Destler sells his house, and for a little while it's bought, and then it passes to somebody else in the Destler family after he dies. And the house sits there. And many of the families that were part of the old guard, I guess, of Cleveland, of Columbus, of the prominent families, they were starting to move east because they're crowded out of downtown. They all had their mansions. In that particular case of that corner was owned by the family until the present building was built on it. Over 100 years, and this was not unusual, 75 to 100 years, that corner was empty. When you go into Columbus, and you see all these parking lots, they were often abandoned by the very family who had it there, because it was cheaper to clear the land, hope for a good price, not sell anything, and you really didn't give a damn who bought it or not. You were free of that. And they became parking lots. The Destler house winds up as a 24/7 hamburger joint, tiny little building built there. So does most of Front Street before the State Department's built. That's an original White Castle site. And then suddenly it'll change and somebody will come back in. So the Destlers are moving further and further east, and the properties all along Broad Street for any of these families were suddenly abandoned, and it was no longer in vogue. And so they were used for used car sales. Some of them made a living room, a showroom out of the living room. They were used for all sorts of purposes that would just break your heart. Not just, I mean, it's one thing to be a mansion and then you become an insurance company. It's another thing, you have a mansion and then it becomes where they sell tires. And that's what Broad Street was. And that's what we don't sometimes recognize. And we didn't either until we started really looking at and following real estate as to what was happening. You don't, there's no one person to solve it. It's market rate. It's what you do. It's to expect it. Columbus did not build. Columbus had offers after World War II to get a VW plant, to get this and that. Industry wanted to come in. First of all, we still have Civil War railroads, so we have these great railroad connections. They wanted to come in, and the movers and shakers of any city who really become the titans who make these decisions or can encourage or discourage them didn't want that. They saw what was happening in Cleveland and Akron and this, and they said, we don't want that kind of industry. And so for a long time, Columbus is a really sleepy little town compared to Cleveland or Cincinnati. And so those are the forces that dictate what's going to happen in a city that we see even today. I'm not sure I answered your question, but.
Like with communism for 40 years, a city like Prague will stay. But other times when there's a boom, things get torn down.
That's a good point.
And as an example, here in Bexley, there's the Wastewater Management slated for demolition. And the value of the lot now during this boom, during this moment, is so valuable.
Right.
Frankly, a lot of the Bexley homes could be threatened by that logic. If it's
Right.
perpetuated, these houses may not add $1 more to the value of the lot. So it's interesting to me how markets, it's not a one way or the other. Unlimited perspective. It could be either way. It depends upon who's interested, who wants to save things, more than necessarily a pop market.
Right. And in America, it's a very right of property to own a property and decide what happens with it. It's very sacred. I mean, zoning does not come in until the 1920s. It goes right to the US Supreme Court and it's being challenged. And because, well, how dare you tell me who can live in my house, or you can do this, or you need a lot line, or that I can't build a gas station in the lot I own next to my house. So, and then Columbus is already annexing in 1912, 13, 14, Milo Grogan, Hanford, here and there. There, all of these little areas, long before Sensenbrenner, are being annexed in. And people say, okay, we're voting for that, because they do have to vote for it. And because we want sewers, we want sidewalks, we want these things. Sewers are always big in Columbus. So as soon as they vote them in, 1920s, they are zoned industrial. That is the death knell for a lot of the communities that come in later, because now it's all, hands off. It will be industry. The Central Market was a good example of Sensenbrenner and Maury Portman, who said to each other, there's urban renewal money possible, and we should be in on it, which was a very valid thing to say. And of course, after World War II, housing is still critical. In the university area, we went to Air for zoning, which means it was the highest zoning density. In place of one house could be a 6-unit apartment building, and that took 25 years to unsettle or to make some restitution for. So what happens is Central Market, built in 1850, first city hall up above on North 4th Street by where Rich crosses, draws 90% of its income from outside the immediate neighborhood. It surrounded it, which was partly German village, partly some just downtown people who were poor, and other parts of the city. 90% of the income's coming from outside the area. The consultants they hire in Chicago say, do not tear down Central Market. It is an economic draw. Other cities are building on it. They're using this. It's important that we keep it. If you do tear it down, then you need to think about where you can build another Central Market exactly sort of in about the same area. And instead, the deal is made for Market Mohawk. They will clear the entire area and the urban renewal money will come in because the city makes money on urban renewal. And once they discover that, the second area they blight is what becomes North Campus at Ohio State. All of those dormitories and things, that is urban renewal. That is a working class and professorial neighborhood of houses. And in Toledo, it got to the point where it was so outrageous that the Willys Jeep plant, when they wanted more land, got on land near them blighted on the condition that none of the houses had air conditioning. And we were talking in the 50s. And the mayor's house was living there and he didn't have air conditioning. And suddenly he finds his own property is blighted. So it is just, sometimes these stories are just so hard to really believe, because it's you're finding your way through the zoning and the property and all of the things you just mentioned too. And we are really out of time and I'm talking way too much. So you're on.
Any other closing questions? We do have books for sale. If you buy it through us, it's 100% donation to Columbus Landmarks, and it's $20. I think Amazon sells it for $25.
I think it's 25 at Barnes and Noble. Yeah.
$24.99 if you buy it at a bookstore.
Okay.
But if you buy it through us, it's 100% donation to Columbus Landmarks Foundation, and we can sign it for you.
And this is Central Market coming down. And just on our signatures, it's worth much more than